Hey, what's up guys? I just want to take a second and make a video talking about Greta Thunberg and her speech at the United Nations, at the UN. She's been all over social media and all over the news as of late because of this speech. And what I want to do in this video is examine her claims and some of the things that she says in that speech and see if they're actually true or not. Are these scientific claims? Is the science on the side of the environmentalists, or is it just propaganda? Is it false? I'm going to be including a link under this video to her speech at the UN from NBC News, and I'm also going to be including a link to scientist Patrick Moore, who has done a lot of videos and has done a lot of work explaining why climate change isn't actually a threat. So let's get into it. Greta Thunberg at the UN said, people are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing, and we are in the beginning of a mass extinction. So one thing that I would respond to this is I'd like a source or some statistic or actual study that says that people are dying and entire ecosystems all over the world are collapsing and crumbling in on themselves because people are using fossil fuels and emitting CO2. That's just not what's happening. Ecosystems all over the globe are not crumbling and coming to an end as we know it. Ecosystems are doing very good. And this idea that we're at the beginning of a mass extinction, there are over 7 billion people that are alive on the earth today. There's animals all over the world, all throughout the oceans, and there's an innumerable amount of plants and trees all over the earth. And from a biblical perspective, in Genesis chapter 1, God actually commands that plants continue to reproduce and fill the earth, that animals in the sea, in the sky, and on the ground continue to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and the sea and the sky. And when God creates Adam and Eve, he says to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over it. So in a biblical worldview, the earth is always going to be full of animals, plants, and human beings, and this implies that there are going to be ecosystems that are strong and aren't crumbling in on themselves. And in Genesis chapter 8, God says that as long as the earth remains, seed time and harvest, day and night, summer and winter, cold and heat, shall not cease. So until the second coming, animals are going to be all over the earth. So are plants, so are humans, so are resources. There's not going to be a shortage of these things. Another statement she made in talking to the people of the United Nations is, all you can talk about is the money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. So this is very significant because to stop using fossil fuels altogether, to stop emitting CO2 altogether as a result of using fossil fuels, and to fight climate change, all of this would cost an immense amount of money. So one reason immediately is because to fight for the government to be involved in fighting climate change, taxes are going to go up. So that's more and more taxes coming out of your income and more taxes coming out of workers. So that's one issue. But another reason is that it would cost an immense amount of money to stop using fossil fuel altogether. We use fossil fuel a lot more than we realize. One huge thing is that cutting fossil fuel would hurt the economy drastically because of international trade. International trade. Container ships come into a country and go out of a country, and when container ships, for example, come into the United States, semi-trucks take those containers full of resources, and trains take those containers that are full of resources all over the country, and containers that are full of resources here go onto container ships and they go to other countries and continents like Europe and Asia, for example. Container ships, semi-trucks, and trains all run on fossil fuel. All of them do. So what the economy would drastically be hurting because of trade. Canceling fossil fuel and getting rid of all fossil fuel would hurt trade terribly. So that would be a huge blow to not only the United States economy, but other countries as well. We also use fossil fuels for a lot of different things. For example, if you own a house or live in a house, that house has electricity. Electricity is often powered by coal. If you have a gas line, the reason that you have heat when it's cold outside is because of fossil fuel. The reason that AC units work is because of electricity, which comes from coal. That's fossil fuel. Your clean water supply. The reason your water is clean is because the mechanisms that clean it run on fossil fuels. Your cars. If you have a gas-powered car or an electric car, electricity comes from coal, so that's running on fossil fuel. And if you have a gas-powered car, well, that's natural gas. Your phone, your iPad, your computers, your electronics are used making oil, and are made using oil, and in order to even be able to use those things, that takes electricity, which comes from fossil fuel as well. I don't believe for a second that people, especially young people like Greta, are actually willing to give up all of these things. You're going to give up all of your entertainment, internet usage, and driving around in cars and all these things to save the planet. I just don't buy it. Also, planes run on fossil fuel, and all these people that are going around nations and the United States, they're always talking about why climate change is a threat and that we need to stop emitting CO2. They're all doing this while driving cars and flying planes and living in houses with electricity. So they're not even willing to give up using CO2. Just something to think about. Greta also said that for more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. And my question is, has it? I mean, Democrats have been saying for decades, in the next 8 to 10 years or something like that, we're doomed. Al Gore said that in the 2000s. We're almost in 2020 and we're still here, and the climate hasn't changed at all since then in terms of drastic heating or cooling. They've been saying this for decades and nothing has happened. So that's one thing. But also, Patrick Moore, a solid scientist in terms of dealing with CO2 and climate change, actually talks about how CO2 and temperature is often always out of sync with each other. So CO2 doesn't contribute to the temperature of the Earth. He also talks about how this quote-unquote warming trend that we've been experiencing on the Earth has lasted for roughly 300 years, long before we started using fossil fuels like we are now. And I'm going to include a link again to a video that he did on PragerU talking about CO2, talking about climate change, so that you can see that in more detail. So no, the science has not been clear in the sense that it's been explicit that climate change is actually a threat. It really isn't. And we know it isn't, because God tells us how the world is going to end. The world is not going to end because we use fossil fuels and destroyed ourselves. The world is going to end when Christ returns for a second time. Returns. Because he hasn't returned for a first time yet. So that's just something, that's another thing to think about. Another statement that Greta made is this: if you really understood the situation, and she's talking to the folks at the United Nations, if you really understood the situation and still failed to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe. And the reason I laugh is because I disagree. I think the UN is evil. I don't think the UN should exist. Big government shouldn't exist. There. Said it. But a few things with this. One, it's not evil to believe that using fossil fuel is okay. It's not evil to recognize that biblically or scientifically that using fossil fuel is totally fine to do. There's nothing wrong with disagreeing and saying, hey, I don't see a problem with using fossil fuel. I don't think you're right on this. That's not evil. But a theological critique I have is from Romans chapter 3, which says everyone's evil. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Everyone is evil because everyone is a sinner. So that, again, that's just something to think about too. You know, the idea that Greta is talking to world leaders, no matter how conservative or liberal they are, and saying that I refuse to believe that you as world leaders in this big government meeting. She denies that any of them are evil at all. It's not accurate. People are evil, and the UN is evil. So again, that's just something that needs to be pointed out. She made another statement saying that you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. And I find that very interesting because, and I'm not knocking her, and I'm not saying that young people can't be smart, but she's a 16-year-old girl who is literally immature because she's not even an adult yet. So, you know, if we're going to talk about immaturity, you know, she's talking to fully grown adults. And you know, I agree in a sense. You know, people at the UN, a lot of them are very liberal and don't hold to a biblical worldview or biblical values. So I'm not going to sit here and defend the UN and all of their beliefs and ways. But to sit and say that they're being immature when she's sat there as a 16-year-old being emotional and yelling, how dare you, how dare you, how dare you, it's a little inconsistent, to say the least. The next statement, a statement she made after that, was that young people are starting to understand your betrayal. It's not a betrayal to use fossil fuel. You know, if I go drive my car, or if I'm using my cell phone or put gas in my car, I'm not betraying anybody. I'm just using a God-given resource that's a good thing to benefit my life, and other people are doing it to benefit their lives. It's not evil. It's not a betrayal. And again, this assumes that young people are geniuses. And so this needs to be said. Young people aren't qualified to be politicians, and there's a reason for that. Young people, their brains aren't even fully developed yet. All right? Young people are not the geniuses of the day, and that's not knocking young people. They are very smart young people. But there's a reason why young people can't be politicians and aren't seen as qualified to be politicians. They haven't had as much time to learn and mature as adults do. So the idea that young people are waking up in the sense that they're smarter than everyone that's older, it's just not true. And, you know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently made a statement like this, not the exact same, but similar to it, that young people are smarter than older people that are alive right now in America, and that's just not true. It's just not true. All right, again, there's a reason that young people, kids, minors, aren't allowed to be politicians. Because they don't understand everything yet. And that's okay. It takes time to learn. The last statement that I'm going to go over that she said is, if you choose to fail us, we will never forgive you. I think this speaks for itself in two different ways. The idea that if you don't stop using fossil fuels, we're not going to forgive you is very immature, very unkind, very hateful. And again, the idea of not forgiving someone, I don't think I have to explain why that's not biblical. We all know that that's not biblical. And just a criticism that I have of this statement, if they fail us, what does that mean? Like, if you fail us as in they just don't stop using fossil fuels, well, then, you know, it's being unreasonable to say that that's a catastrophe. But do you mean that they're going to fail us in the sense that we're all going to die and the world's going to end and, you know, no more humanity, no more Earth? Because if that's what you mean, then it doesn't matter if you forgive them or not. You can't live in a state of unforgiveness towards them if you're dead and everyone else is dead. And if you, and if they, if CO2 hasn't killed us all, then your unforgiveness of them is unreasonable because you were wrong and CO2 hasn't killed us all, so they haven't failed us. That's just something that I noticed when listening to the speech. So that's just some statements that she made, and I find them to be very concerning, not only because it's unscientific, but because it's unbiblical. In a previous video that I made, I explained why climate change being a threat is an unbiblical idea. I recommend you go watch it because it's true. The idea of climate change being a threat to human life as we know it, to animal and plant life as we know it, and to the earth as we know it is an unbiblical idea. And not only is it unbiblical, it's idolatry because it's worship of the creation, to the point where that has to be the only thing that we focus on. And another thing I'll say is, if you believe that human beings are capable of or absolutely will end the earth, end the world, end all life as we know it, and the second coming of Christ isn't even on your radar, that's a denial of the second coming of Christ. All right, you can't believe this extreme leftist, liberal, anti-biblical worldview of climate change that has these anti-biblical and heretical claims and also believe in gospel truths. Because again, you can't worship the earth, you can't worship the creation, you can't worship Mother Nature, and you can't deny the second coming of Christ and claim that you believe in the gospel. Anyway, that's it for me. Please click like, please share this on your social media, and thank you for listening. That's it for me. Bye.